They call me Lady Vesper. And if there's one thing society fears more than scandal, it's buried secrets. Today, I invite you to uncover what happens when the blood coursing through a lady's veins does not belong to the lineage that raised her. Charlotte Ashworth believed she was heir to everything. Little did she know, it was merely the beginning of her downfall, and perhaps of her true freedom. The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of the grand entrance hall, illuminating portraits of stern-faced ancestors whose eyes seemed to follow visitors with the weight of centuries of accumulated privilege. Lady Charlotte Ashworth, 22 years of age and possessed of the kind of ethereal beauty that graced only the finest bloodlines, descended the sweeping mahogany staircase with the fluid grace that marked her breeding. Her emerald silk morning dress, adorned with intricate French lace, rustled softly against the Persian runners that lined the corridors like whispered secrets. The servant bells chimed their morning symphony throughout the manor, each tone precisely timed to maintain the clockwork efficiency that distinguished proper English households. Mrs. Pemberton, the head housekeeper whose starched white cap never showed so much as a single wrinkle, supervised the daily rituals with military precision. The under-housemaids moved through their choreographed duties like dancers in an elaborate ballet, their movements synchronized by decades of tradition, and the unspoken understanding that perfection was not merely expected, but absolutely required. In the breakfast room, where Wedgwood china reflected the morning light streaming through tall windows draped in sapphire velvet, the family gathered for their morning repast. The Earl of Thornfield, Lord Reginald Ashworth, sat at the head of the mahogany table, his presence commanding even in the simple act of reading the Times. His salt and pepper whiskers were perfectly groomed, his morning coat pressed to eliminate even the suggestion of a wrinkle. Beside him, the Countess, Lady Margaret Ashworth, embodied the refined elegance that came from a lifetime of careful cultivation, her silver hair arranged in an elaborate coiffure that defied both gravity and the passage of time. The social machinery of the English aristocracy operated with the precision of a Swiss timepiece. Every gesture carried meaning, every word held weight, every glance conveyed volumes of unspoken communication. In this rarefied world, bloodlines were more precious than gold, and legitimacy served as the cornerstone upon which entire dynasties were built. The concept of noble birth was not merely a social convenience but a sacred trust, passed down through generations like a holy relic that must never be tarnished or questioned. Charlotte had been raised to understand her place in this intricate web of hereditary privilege. From her earliest memories, she had been groomed for the responsibilities that came with noble blood. Her education had been impeccable, overseen by the finest governesses and tutors that money could procure. She spoke French with Parisian fluency, played the pianoforte with concert-level skill, and could navigate the complex protocols of court presentation with the natural ease of one born to the purple. The morning routine at Thornfield Manor followed patterns established by centuries of tradition. After breakfast, Lord Ashworth would retire to his study to attend to estate business and correspondence, while Lady Ashworth would meet with the housekeeper to discuss the daily management of their vast household. Charlotte would typically spend her mornings in the conservatory, tending to her extensive collection of rare orchids, or in the library, where first editions of the great literary works lined shelves that reached toward ornate plaster ceilings decorated with cherubs and golden laurel wreaths. But on this particular morning, an atmosphere of solemnity pervaded the manor. The family solicitor, Mr. Reginald Blackwood, had arrived the previous evening from London, his black carriage and somber demeanor announcing the gravity of his visit. Word had spread through the servant hierarchy with the efficiency of a military dispatch system that the Earl was gravely ill, though the exact nature of his condition remained shrouded in the kind of respectful silence that surrounded all matters of mortality in polite society. Dr. Pemberton, the family physician whose reputation extended throughout the county, had been making increasingly frequent visits to Thornfield Manor. His medical bag, worn smooth by decades of service to the aristocracy, had become a familiar sight in the corridors. The servants moved with hushed reverence, their usual chatter replaced by whispered consultations and meaningful glances, that spoke of shared concern for their beloved master. The great estate of Thornfield encompassed thousands of acres of prime agricultural land, tenant farms that had been worked by the same families for generations, and investments that stretched across the empire upon which the sun never set. The wealth accumulated over centuries of careful stewardship and advantageous marriages had created a financial foundation that seemed as permanent as the very hills upon which the manor stood. Yet wealth, no matter how vast, could not purchase immunity from the inevitable march of time or the frailties of mortal flesh. In the servants' hall, where a rigid hierarchy mirrored that of the family they served, speculation ran rampant about the future of the estate. Would young Lord Edward, Charlotte's brother currently serving with distinction in Her Majesty's cavalry in India, return in time to assume his responsibilities? What provisions would be made for Charlotte, whose marriage prospects represented not merely personal happiness, but strategic alliances that could strengthen or weaken the family's position in society? The architecture of Thornfield Manor itself seemed to embody the permanence and stability that the Ashworth family represented. The honey-colored stone had weathered centuries of English seasons, from harsh winters when snow transformed the landscape into a crystalline wonderland, to glorious summers when the gardens erupted in symphonies of color and fragrance. The great hall, with its soaring ceilings and magnificent chandelier imported from Venice during the reign of George II, had witnessed countless celebrations, from christenings to wedding receptions, from Christmas festivities to state dinners where members of Parliament and foreign dignitaries had discussed matters of empire and commerce. Every room in the manor told stories of accumulated history and inherited privilege. The portrait gallery displayed 7 generations of Ashworth ancestors, their painted eyes seeming to observe the present with the accumulated wisdom of centuries. The library contained volumes that chronicled not merely the intellectual pursuits of the family, but their connections to the great movements of English history, from the defeat of the Spanish Armada to the victories at Trafalgar and Waterloo. As Charlotte moved through the familiar corridors of her ancestral home, she could not have imagined that within hours, everything she believed about herself, her family, and her place in the world would be shattered by revelations that would challenge the very foundations of her existence. The marble floors that had supported generations of Ashworth feet would soon witness a scene of such devastating revelation that its echoes would reverberate through the family for generations to come. The afternoon sun filtered through the stained glass windows of the blue drawing room, casting prismatic patterns across the Aubusson carpet that had been woven specifically for the 3rd Earl of Thornfield during the reign of King George III. The room, with its hand-painted Chinese wallpaper depicting scenes of imperial gardens and exotic birds, served as the formal reception area, where the family conducted business of the utmost importance. Today, the space felt charged with an electricity that seemed to emanate from the very walls themselves. Mr. Reginald Blackwood, senior partner of Blackwood, Hartwell and Associates, the most prestigious solicitors firm in London, sat behind a mahogany escritoire that had once belonged to Lord Byron. His appearance spoke of discretion and competence. Silver hair meticulously groomed, steel-rimmed spectacles that reflected the afternoon light, and a black wool suit that bore the hallmarks of Savile Row tailoring. Before him lay a leather portfolio containing documents that would forever alter the destiny of one of England's most distinguished families. The Earl of Thornfield had requested that the entire family be present for this reading, a decision that had puzzled many, but was respected without question. Lord Edward had returned from India on emergency leave, his sun-bronzed face showing the strain of rapid travel and deep concern for his father's deteriorating health. He stood near the fireplace, his military bearing evident in every line of his posture, though his eyes betrayed the emotional turmoil that he worked so diligently to conceal. Lady Margaret Ashworth occupied her customary chair, an 18th-century piece upholstered in cream silk that had been her wedding gift from the Queen Mother herself. Her hands, adorned with the magnificent sapphire and diamond rings that marked her status as countess, remained folded in her lap with the composure that had made her legendary in court circles. Yet those who knew her well might have detected the slight tremor that betrayed her inner agitation. Charlotte entered the drawing room wearing a dress of deep burgundy wool, its color chosen unconsciously to reflect the gravity of the occasion. Her golden hair had been arranged in an elaborate chignon secured with pearl pins that caught the afternoon light, and her complexion, usually radiant with the bloom of youth and privilege, appeared pale against the rich fabric of her gown. She took her seat on the chintz sofa that faced the solicitor, her posture impeccable despite the undercurrent of anxiety that seemed to permeate the very air of the room. The supporting cast of this domestic drama included Mrs. Pemberton, whose presence had been specifically requested by the Earl, and Dr. Matthews, the family physician whose medical expertise had been deemed necessary given the sensitive nature of certain revelations. Their faces bore expressions of professional discretion mixed with personal concern, for they had served the Ashworth family for decades and their loyalty ran deeper than mere employment. Mr. Blackwood cleared his throat with the authority of one accustomed to commanding attention in the most distinguished circles. His voice, cultured by years at Oxford and refined by decades of practice in the highest courts of the land, carried the weight of absolute certainty as he began the formal proceedings. My lords and ladies, we are gathered today to hear the final testament and wishes of Reginald Charles Ashworth, 7th Earl of Thornfield, as set forth in his last will and testament, properly witnessed and sealed according to the laws of England. His words fell into the silence like stones dropped into still water, creating ripples of anticipation that seemed to touch every corner of the ornate room. The preliminaries followed the expected patterns established by centuries of English legal tradition. The vast estates, encompassing not merely Thornfield Manor but properties in Scotland, Wales, and the West Indies, would pass to Lord Edward as the eldest son and heir apparent. The magnificent jewelry collection, including pieces that had belonged to Queen Charlotte herself, would remain with Lady Margaret during her lifetime before passing to future generations. Charlotte listened with the detached interest of one who had always understood her position in the family hierarchy. As the daughter of the house, she would receive a generous dowry that would ensure her ability to make an advantageous marriage, along with certain personal items that held sentimental rather than financial value. The reading proceeded with the methodical precision that characterized all legal proceedings, each bequest carefully enumerated and explained. But then Mr. Blackwood paused, his expression shifting almost imperceptibly as he reached a section of the document that clearly required delicate handling. The atmosphere in the room seemed to grow thick, as if the very air had become difficult to breathe. He adjusted his spectacles with hands that, for the first time during the proceedings, showed the slightest tremor. There is, however, a matter of particular sensitivity that his lordship insisted must be addressed with complete honesty and transparency. The solicitor's voice carried a new gravity that caused everyone present to lean forward slightly, their attention focused with laser-like intensity on his words. It concerns the circumstances surrounding the birth of Lady Charlotte and certain irregularities in the documentation that has heretofore been accepted without question. The pause that followed these words seemed to stretch into eternity, filled with the kind of silence that precedes earthquakes or other natural disasters that forever alter familiar landscapes. Charlotte felt her heart begin to pound with such force that she feared others might hear it. Her hands, previously folded demurely in her lap, now gripped the silk of her dress with sufficient force to create permanent wrinkles. Something in the solicitor's tone, in the careful choice of his words, in the meaningful glances exchanged between Dr. Matthews and Mrs. Pemberton, suggested that the foundations of her world were about to shift in ways she could not yet comprehend. Lady Margaret's composure, legendary throughout society for its imperturbability, showed the first signs of strain. Her breathing became slightly more rapid, and the hand that held her lace handkerchief trembled almost imperceptibly. Lord Edward moved closer to his sister, his military instincts alerting him to approaching danger, even though he could not yet identify its source. The blue drawing room, which had witnessed countless family gatherings over the centuries, seemed to hold its breath as Mr. Blackwood prepared to continue his reading. The portraits of previous earls and countesses looked down from their gilded frames with expressions that seemed suddenly accusatory, as if they too were aware that long-hidden secrets were about to be revealed. Outside the tall windows, the gardens of Thornfield Manor continued their eternal cycles of growth and decay, beauty and dormancy, oblivious to the human drama unfolding within the walls of the great house. The ancient oak trees that had shaded the manor for centuries stood as silent witnesses to whatever revelations were about to transform the Ashworth family forever. Mr. Blackwood lifted another document from his leather portfolio, this one bearing seals and ribbons that suggested official government documentation. His hands moved with deliberate care as he unfolded papers that had clearly been stored with the utmost security and confidentiality. His lordship has directed that I read, in its entirety, a statement that he prepared in his own hand, witnessed by myself and Dr. Matthews, concerning events that occurred during the year 1814. The formality of his language could not disguise the explosive nature of what was about to be revealed. The clock on the mantelpiece ticked with metronomic precision, marking the seconds before Charlotte's life would be forever changed. Each tick seemed to echo through the room like a harbinger of approaching doom, counting down to a moment that would divide her existence into before and after, into the comfortable certainties of her youth, and the harsh realities of a truth that had been hidden for over 2 decades. The words that Mr. Blackwood spoke next fell upon the assembled company like thunderbolts from a clear sky, each syllable precisely enunciated, yet seemingly impossible to comprehend. I, Reginald Charles Ashworth, being of sound mind and body, do hereby confess that Lady Charlotte Ashworth, whom I have claimed as my legitimate daughter for the duration of her life, is not born of my blood nor of my beloved wife Margaret. The silence that followed this pronouncement was absolute, as if the very walls of Thornfield Manor had absorbed not merely sound but the capacity for breath itself. Charlotte felt the world tilt beneath her, as though the marble floors had suddenly become the deck of a ship caught in a violent storm. The familiar boundaries of her existence, as solid and permanent as the stone foundations of the manor, crumbled like ancient parchment exposed to flame. Lady Margaret released a sound that was part gasp, part sob, her carefully maintained composure finally cracking under the weight of revelations that struck at the very heart of everything she held sacred. Her handkerchief fell from nerveless fingers to the Aubusson carpet, a small white square that seemed to symbolize the surrender of all pretense and dignity. Lord Edward stepped protectively toward his sister, his face flushed with the kind of righteous anger that had served him well on the battlefields of India. "This is preposterous," he declared, his voice carrying the authority of one accustomed to command. "Charlotte is my sister, born and bred of Ashworth blood. No document, no matter how official in appearance, can alter the truth of what we all know to be fact." But Mr. Blackwood continued reading with the inexorable precision of a judicial proceeding, his voice never wavering despite the emotional chaos he was unleashing. "The child who bears the name Charlotte was born to one Miss Isabella Hartwell, a governess who entered our employ in the spring of 1813. The circumstances of her conception occurred during a period of temporary estrangement between myself and my wife, when grief over the loss of our infant son had driven us to seek solace in separate pursuits. The revelation hit Charlotte like a physical blow, stealing her breath and sending her mind reeling backward through 22 years of memories that suddenly took on entirely different meanings. Every loving glance from the man she had called father, every moment of pride in her aristocratic heritage, every assumption about her place in the world had been built upon a foundation of carefully constructed lies. Isabella Hartwell. The name meant nothing to Charlotte, yet it represented everything she had never been told about herself. Who was this woman whose blood ran through her veins? What had become of her after bringing an illegitimate child into one of England's most distinguished families? The questions multiplied in Charlotte's mind like ripples in a disturbed pond, each one spawning dozens of others that demanded answers she might never receive. Dr. Matthews stepped forward, his medical bag in hand, clearly concerned about the physical impact these revelations were having on the family members. His decades of service to the Ashworths had given him insights into their characters and constitutions that went far beyond mere professional observation. He had delivered Charlotte himself, had tended to her childhood illnesses, had watched her grow from a precocious child into a young woman of remarkable beauty and intelligence. Perhaps, he suggested gently, we might pause these proceedings to allow everyone to process what has been revealed. Such shocking news requires time for proper comprehension and emotional adjustment. His voice carried the authority of one whose medical expertise had guided the family through countless crises, but Mr. Blackwood shook his head with the firm determination of one carrying out sacred instructions. His lordship was most specific that the entire document be read without interruption, regardless of the emotional impact upon those present. He believed that partial revelations would be crueler than complete honesty, however painful that honesty might prove to be. Charlotte found her voice, though it seemed to come from someone else entirely, someone whose world had not just been turned upside down by a few sentences read from a legal document. What became of her? This Isabella Hartwell who gave birth to me. The question emerged as barely more than a whisper, yet it carried the weight of desperate need to understand the truth about her origins. Mrs. Pemberton, whose loyalty to the family had never wavered in 40 years of service, stepped forward with tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. Her position as head housekeeper had given her access to family secrets that others could only speculate about, and her expression suggested that she possessed knowledge that she had been sworn never to reveal. Miss Isabella was a gentle soul, my lady, if I may speak freely. She loved you with all her heart, though she knew from the moment of your birth that she could never acknowledge you as her own. She remained at the manor until you were weaned, helping to care for you in secret, before accepting a position with a family in Scotland. She made his lordship promise that you would be raised as true nobility, with all the advantages and education that your intelligence deserved. The image of this unknown mother began to take shape in Charlotte's mind, a woman who had sacrificed everything for her child's welfare, who had endured the disgrace of bearing an illegitimate child in exchange for ensuring that child would have opportunities that would otherwise have been forever beyond reach. The nobility that Charlotte had always assumed came from aristocratic breeding might instead have been inherited from a woman who had demonstrated the highest form of courage and selfless love. Lady Margaret, who had maintained her silence since the initial revelation, finally spoke, her voice carrying decades of accumulated pain and carefully buried resentment. I agreed to raise you as my own daughter because I could not bear children after the loss of our son. You became the daughter I could never have naturally, and my love for you has never been artificial or calculated. But the deception has weighed upon my soul like a stone, growing heavier with each passing year. The complexity of emotions swirling through the blue drawing room defied easy categorization. Love and betrayal intermingled with legitimate anger and desperate need for understanding. Charlotte struggled to reconcile the parents who had raised her with infinite care and affection with the people who had built her entire existence upon a fundamental lie. Mr. Blackwood consulted his documents once more, his expression grave as he prepared to deliver additional revelations that would further complicate an already impossible situation. There is more, I am afraid. His lordship's confession includes details about Miss Isabella's background that may prove relevant to Lady Charlotte's future circumstances. The afternoon light streaming through the stained glass windows seemed to dim, as if the very sun were reluctant to illuminate further secrets that had been hidden in darkness for so long. Charlotte braced herself for whatever additional shocks awaited, her mind already reeling from revelations that challenged every assumption she had ever made about herself and her place in the world. Outside the windows of Thornfield Manor, the world continued its normal patterns of activity, oblivious to the personal earthquake occurring within the walls of the great house. Servants continued their duties, gardeners tended to late-season flowers, and the eternal rhythms of rural life proceeded without pause. But inside the blue drawing room, time seemed suspended as a family grappled with truths that would forever alter their understanding of themselves and each other. The weight of secrets finally revealed pressed down upon everyone present like a suffocating blanket, making breathing difficult and coherent thought nearly impossible. Yet beneath the shock and confusion, seeds of new understanding began to germinate, promising growth that might eventually lead to healing, though the path forward remained shrouded in uncertainty and pain. The confession continued with relentless precision, each word carved from stone and delivered with the weight of judicial pronouncement. Mr. Blackwood's voice never wavered as he read the most devastating portions of Lord Ashworth's final testament, though his hands trembled slightly as he turned each page, fully aware that he was destroying a family's carefully constructed mythology with every syllable. Miss Isabella Hartwell was not merely a governess of modest background, as we allowed society to believe. She was, in fact, the illegitimate daughter of the Duke of Marlborough, a secret carefully guarded by her mother, who served as lady-in-waiting to Her Royal Highness Princess Charlotte Augusta of Wales. Her bloodline, though tainted by illegitimacy, carried noble heritage that perhaps explains the natural grace and intelligence that have marked our dear Charlotte throughout her life. This revelation struck Charlotte like lightning illuminating a dark landscape, suddenly making visible features that had been hidden in shadow. The aristocratic bearing that everyone had attributed to Ashworth breeding might instead have come from ducal blood that flowed through her veins from an entirely different source. The irony was not lost on her that she, now revealed as illegitimate herself, had inherited noble blood from another illegitimate line, creating a complex web of hereditary legitimacy and social deception. Lady Margaret rose from her chair with shaking hands, her face pale as porcelain but her eyes blazing with emotions too complex to name. You speak of bloodlines and heritage as if they matter more than the love that has bound this family together for 22 years. Charlotte has been my daughter in every way that counts, raised with devotion and care that no natural mother could have exceeded. Her words carried the force of absolute conviction, yet they could not erase the legal and social realities that Charlotte now faced. In the rigid hierarchy of English society, legitimacy was not merely a matter of affection or upbringing, but a fundamental requirement for inheritance, social standing, and matrimonial prospects. The revelation of her true parentage would inevitably spread throughout society, despite whatever efforts might be made to contain it. Lord Edward moved to stand directly behind Charlotte's chair, his hands resting protectively on her shoulders in a gesture that spoke louder than any words about his continued loyalty and love. Sister or not by blood, Charlotte remains my family by choice and affection. No revelation about the circumstances of her birth can alter the bond that has existed between us since childhood. But even as he spoke these noble words, the practical implications of the situation began to dawn on everyone present. Charlotte's engagement to Lord Pemberton, announced just weeks earlier with great fanfare and celebration, would almost certainly be terminated once news of her illegitimacy became public knowledge. The carefully negotiated terms of that union, which would have united two of England's most prestigious families while bringing substantial financial benefits to both parties, could not survive the scandal of such revelations. Dr. Matthews approached Charlotte with the gentle concern of one who had tended to her health since infancy, his medical expertise alerting him to signs of shock that could have serious physical consequences. Her breathing had become shallow and rapid, her complexion had taken on an alarming pallor, and her hands trembled with increasing violence despite her efforts to maintain composure. "My dear child," he said softly, his voice carrying decades of paternal care despite the lack of biological relationship, "you must remember that the circumstances of your birth do not diminish your intrinsic worth or the genuine love that has surrounded you throughout your life. You are the same remarkable young woman you were when you awakened this morning, regardless of what legal documents might reveal about your parentage." Charlotte looked up at him with eyes that seemed to have aged years in the space of hours, their usual sparkle dimmed by the weight of knowledge that could never be forgotten or ignored. "But I am not the same person, Dr. Matthews. Everything I believed about myself, every assumption I made about my future, every plan I had made for my life has been built upon foundations that have just crumbled to dust." The philosophical implications of her situation struck her with particular force. Was identity determined by blood and breeding, as society insisted, or by love and upbringing, as her heart wanted to believe? Could 22 years of aristocratic education and refinement be negated by revelations about illegitimate birth? Would the skills she had acquired, the intelligence she had developed, the character she had formed suddenly become worthless because they were not supported by legitimate noble blood? Mr. Blackwood cleared his throat once more, indicating that the revelations were not yet complete. His lordship's testament includes specific instructions regarding Lady Charlotte's future welfare, and the provisions he has made to ensure her security despite the change in her legal status. The word provisions carried ominous implications. Charlotte understood immediately that whatever financial arrangements had been made for her, they would necessarily be far less generous than what she would have received as a legitimate daughter. The vast dowry that would have made her one of the most sought-after marriage prospects in England would be replaced by something more modest, more appropriate to her actual station in life. A trust has been established in the amount of £50,000, to be administered by Blackwood, Hartwell, and Associates for Lady Charlotte's benefit. Additionally, she will receive the contents of the Rose bedroom, including the jewelry that belonged to her natural mother, Isabella Hartwell, and certain personal effects that his lordship believed she should possess as her rightful inheritance. £50,000 represented a substantial sum by any ordinary measure, certainly enough to ensure that Charlotte would never face poverty or destitution. Yet it was a fraction of what she would have received as a legitimate daughter, and the reduction in her financial prospects would inevitably affect her position in society and her prospects for an advantageous marriage. Mrs. Pemberton stepped forward with a small velvet jewelry case that she had apparently been instructed to produce at this moment in the proceedings. Her eyes were red with tears as she presented it to Charlotte, her voice barely above a whisper as she spoke. "These belong to your mother, my lady. Miss Isabella wore them on the day of your birth and made me promise that someday you would know they were yours by right." Charlotte accepted the case with hands that trembled so violently she nearly dropped it. Inside, nestled against white silk, lay a pearl necklace of exquisite beauty, clearly expensive but not ostentatious, the kind of jewelry that spoke of refined taste rather than overwhelming wealth. Accompanying it was a miniature portrait of a young woman with Charlotte's own golden hair and delicate features, painted with such skill that it seemed the subject might speak at any moment. Looking upon the face of Isabella Hartwell for the first time, Charlotte felt a connection that transcended the legal definitions of legitimacy and social standing. This woman, whoever she had been, had possessed the same eyes that Charlotte saw in her own mirror each morning, the same determined set to her jaw, the same expression of intelligence and sensitivity that others had always commented upon in Charlotte herself. The portrait revealed a woman of obvious refinement and education, dressed in simple but elegant clothing that suggested modest prosperity rather than poverty. Her expression conveyed both strength and vulnerability, as if she possessed the courage necessary to face difficult circumstances while maintaining the tenderness that made such courage bearable. "She was beautiful," Charlotte whispered, her voice filled with wonder and sorrow in equal measure. "And she looks so young. How old was she when I was born?" Dr. Matthews consulted his own records, which he had apparently been instructed to bring to this meeting. "Miss Isabella was 19 years of age when you were born, just 3 years younger than you are now. She faced circumstances that would have broken a lesser woman, yet she maintained her dignity and her concern for your welfare above all other considerations." The tragedy of Isabella Hartwell's situation began to unfold in Charlotte's imagination. A young woman of noble blood but illegitimate birth, forced to work as a governess to support herself, finding herself pregnant by her employer and facing social disgrace that could have ruined her entirely. Yet she had somehow found the strength to ensure her child's welfare, while sacrificing her own hopes for recognition or security. As the afternoon shadows lengthened across the blue drawing room, Charlotte began to understand that the revelation of her true parentage was not merely an ending, but also a beginning. The comfortable certainties of her aristocratic upbringing had been shattered, but in their place emerged the possibility of a different kind of nobility, one based not upon inherited privilege, but upon personal courage and the capacity to create meaning from difficult circumstances. The immediate aftermath of the reading brought with it a cascade of practical considerations that threatened to overwhelm Charlotte's already fragile emotional state. Word of the revelation would inevitably spread beyond the walls of Thornfield Manor, despite whatever efforts might be made to maintain discretion. The servant network that connected great houses throughout England operated with the efficiency of a telegraph system, and news of such magnitude could not be contained indefinitely. Lord Pemberton arrived at Thornfield Manor within hours of receiving an urgent message from Lord Edward, his face bearing the grim expression of a man who suspected that his carefully laid plans were about to be disrupted by circumstances beyond his control. He was a practical man of 35 years, whose interest in Charlotte had been motivated as much by financial advantage and social positioning as by any romantic attachment, though he had grown genuinely fond of her during their brief courtship. The meeting between Charlotte and her former fiancé took place in the conservatory, where her collection of rare orchids provided a backdrop that seemed ironically appropriate for a conversation about the delicate nature of social arrangements, and the ease with which they could be destroyed by unexpected revelations. The afternoon light filtering through the glass walls cast long shadows that seemed to symbolize the uncertainty that now clouded Charlotte's future. "My dear Charlotte," Lord Pemberton began, his voice carrying the careful modulation of one who had practiced diplomacy in both personal and professional spheres, "you must understand that my feelings for you personally remain unchanged. Your character, your intelligence, your natural grace, these qualities that drew me to you initially are not diminished by revelations about your parentage." Charlotte listened to his words with growing understanding of what he was not saying directly. His feelings might remain unchanged, but his circumstances had been fundamentally altered by her change in status. The financial arrangements that had been negotiated between their families, the social advantages that their union would have provided, the carefully balanced exchange of dowry for title, all of these considerations had been thrown into chaos by the revelation of her illegitimacy. "However," he continued, his tone becoming more formal as he shifted into the language of negotiation and legal precision, "you must surely recognize that the circumstances surrounding our engagement have been materially altered. The agreements reached between our families were based upon understandings that have proven to be inaccurate, and I fear that continuation of our betrothal would create difficulties for both parties." The breaking of the engagement was handled with all the delicacy that generations of aristocratic breeding could provide. Yet Charlotte felt each carefully chosen word like a physical blow. She had not loved Lord Pemberton with the passionate intensity that romantic novels described, but she had grown comfortable with the prospect of becoming his wife, of taking her place as mistress of his estates, of fulfilling the role for which she had been trained since childhood. More devastating than the loss of her fiancé was the gradual recognition of how completely her social position had been compromised. Invitations that had been extended for upcoming events were quietly withdrawn through messages delivered by apologetic servants who could barely meet her eyes. Friends who had sought her company eagerly just days before suddenly found themselves unavailable for social calls or chance encounters in the village. Lady Beatrice Worthington, who had been Charlotte's closest friend since their presentation at court, arrived at Thornfield Manor with tears streaming down her face and a resolution that had clearly cost her considerable emotional effort. "Charlotte, my dearest friend, you must know that my personal affection for you remains as strong as ever. But my mother has made it clear that continued association with you would compromise my own prospects for an advantageous marriage." The social machinery that had previously supported Charlotte's position in society now worked against her with ruthless efficiency. The same networks that had celebrated her achievements and admired her beauty now served to spread news of her illegitimacy, and to enforce the unwritten, but absolute rules that governed aristocratic behavior. She had become, quite literally overnight, a social pariah whose very presence could taint the reputations of those who associated with her. Yet even as external support crumbled around her, Charlotte discovered reserves of inner strength that she had never been required to access during her privileged upbringing. The shock of revelation gradually gave way to a different kind of understanding, one that encompassed not merely what she had lost, but what she might still become. The portrait of Isabella Hartwell, which she now kept constantly nearby, served as a reminder that courage in the face of social disgrace was not merely possible, but could be transformative. Dr. Matthews became her most reliable source of comfort and practical advice during these difficult days. His long service to the family had given him insights into the workings of society that extended far beyond his medical training, and his genuine affection for Charlotte motivated him to provide guidance that others might have considered inappropriate given her changed circumstances. "My dear child," he told her during one of their private conversations, "you must remember that society's judgment, however harsh, is not the final measure of a person's worth. Your mother, Isabella, faced circumstances far more difficult than those you now confront. Yet she managed to create a life of meaning and dignity. Her example suggests that you too possess the strength necessary to overcome these temporary setbacks." The practical arrangements for Charlotte's future required careful negotiation and considerable delicacy. The £50,000 provided by Lord Ashworth's trust would ensure her financial security, but the income it generated would not support the lifestyle to which she had become accustomed. She would need to learn to live more modestly, to make choices based upon necessity rather than mere preference, to develop skills that she had never needed as a member of the aristocracy. Mrs. Pemberton proved invaluable in helping Charlotte adapt to her new circumstances. Her decades of managing household affairs had given her practical skills that complemented her natural discretion and loyalty. "You have intelligence and education that will serve you well, my lady," she observed during one of their planning sessions. "Many women of your background and abilities have found meaningful lives as companions to elderly ladies or as governesses to children of good families." The suggestion that she might need to work for her living represented perhaps the most dramatic change in Charlotte's expectations for her future. The idle luxury that had characterized her life until now would be replaced by the necessity of earning her keep through useful labor. Yet rather than feeling degraded by this prospect, she found herself curious about what she might discover about her own capabilities when tested by genuine need. Lord Edward proved to be her most steadfast supporter during this period of adjustment. His military service had given him a practical understanding of how quickly circumstances could change, and how important it was to adapt to new realities rather than mourning lost opportunities. "Charlotte," he told her with characteristic directness, "you have been dealt a difficult hand, but you still hold cards worth playing. Your intelligence, your education, your natural abilities, these advantages cannot be taken away by social prejudice or legal technicalities." As the initial shock of revelation began to fade, Charlotte found herself experiencing moments of something that might almost be called relief. The weight of expectations that had pressed upon her shoulders since childhood, the need to make an advantageous marriage, to maintain family honor, to live up to aristocratic standards, had been lifted by circumstances beyond her control. For the first time in her life, she was free to make choices based upon her own desires rather than social obligations. The gardens of Thornfield Manor, where she had spent countless hours during her privileged youth, took on new significance as she walked among them during the autumn evenings. The carefully manicured landscapes that had once symbolized the control and order of aristocratic life now seemed to represent the artificial nature of social conventions that could be changed by human decision rather than natural law. In the growing darkness of these evening walks, Charlotte began to formulate plans for a future that would be entirely different from anything she had previously imagined. The revelation of her true parentage had closed certain doors forever, but it had also opened others that she had never known existed. The question now was whether she possessed the courage necessary to walk through them into an uncertain, but potentially fulfilling future. 3 months after the reading of Lord Ashworth's testament, Charlotte stood in the morning room of a modest but elegant townhouse in Bath, arranging flowers that she had purchased herself at the local market with money she had earned through her own labor. The transformation in her circumstances had been complete, yet she found herself experiencing a contentment that had been absent during her years of aristocratic privilege. The position she had accepted as companion to Lady Eloise Pemberton, the elderly aunt of her former fiancé, had proved to be both challenging and rewarding in ways she had never anticipated. Lady Eloise, a formidable woman of 80 years whose sharp intelligence had been undimmed by age, had seen past Charlotte's illegitimate birth to recognize qualities that made her an ideal companion for someone who valued conversation over mere social standing. "My dear Charlotte," Lady Eloise had announced during their first interview, "I care nothing for the circumstances of your birth and everything for the quality of your mind. You have been educated as a gentlewoman. You possess natural refinement that no amount of breeding can guarantee, and you have the courage necessary to face difficult circumstances with dignity. These are the qualities I require in a companion, not an impeccable pedigree." The work itself had introduced Charlotte to aspects of life that her aristocratic upbringing had never revealed. She read aloud to Lady Eloise for several hours each day, selecting books that challenged both their intellects and provided material for the kind of stimulating discussion that had been rare in Charlotte's previous social circle. She managed Lady Eloise's correspondence, organized her social calendar, and served as her representative in various charitable endeavors that brought them into contact with people from all levels of society. Most surprisingly, Charlotte discovered that she possessed a natural aptitude for managing practical affairs that had never been tested during her privileged youth. She negotiated with tradespeople, supervised household staff, and handled financial matters with a competence that impressed even Lady Eloise, whose own business sense had been honed by decades of managing her own affairs after being widowed at an early age. The social circles in Bath proved to be more flexible and accepting than those she had known in London. The city attracted people whose circumstances had changed, who had fallen from higher stations or risen from lower ones, and who had learned to value character over lineage. Charlotte found herself welcomed into a community of interesting and accomplished individuals who judged her by her present actions rather than her past circumstances. Among these new acquaintances was Mr. James Whitmore, a gentleman of modest fortune who had made his money through successful investments in trade rather than through inherited wealth. His background would have made him unacceptable as a suitor during Charlotte's aristocratic days, but her changed circumstances allowed her to appreciate qualities that she had previously been trained to overlook. Mr. Whitmore was a man of 30 years, possessed of the kind of quiet confidence that came from having succeeded through his own efforts rather than inherited privilege. His education had been acquired through scholarship rather than family wealth. His manners reflected genuine consideration rather than artificial polish, and his conversation revealed an intelligence that had been sharpened by contact with the practical world rather than refined by academic leisure. Their courtship proceeded slowly and carefully, built upon genuine mutual respect and growing affection rather than the calculated exchanges that had characterized Charlotte's previous engagement. Mr. Whitmore made no secret of his knowledge about her circumstances, yet he valued her for who she had become rather than mourning what she had lost. "Charlotte," he told her during one of their walks through the elegant crescents of Bath, "you have discovered something that many people never learn, that true worth comes from character and action rather than from accident of birth. The challenges you have faced have revealed strengths that might never have emerged under easier circumstances." The wisdom of his observation became clear to Charlotte as she reflected upon the changes that had occurred in her understanding of herself and the world around her. The comfortable certainties of aristocratic life had been replaced by something far more valuable: the knowledge that she could adapt to changing circumstances, that she could find meaning and satisfaction in useful work, and that genuine happiness could be built upon foundations of mutual respect and shared values rather than social convenience. News from Thornfield Manor arrived regularly through letters from Lord Edward, who had assumed his responsibilities as the new Earl with the same dedication he had shown to his military service. His correspondence revealed a man who had been strengthened rather than diminished by the challenges his family had faced, and who had learned to value authenticity over appearance in both personal and business relationships. "Dearest Charlotte," he wrote in one particularly revealing letter, "I find that the revelations about our family history have freed me from certain expectations that I had always found burdensome. I am building relationships with our tenants based upon mutual respect rather than inherited deference, and I am making business decisions based upon practical considerations rather than social traditions. In a strange way, the shattering of our family mythology has allowed us all to become more genuinely ourselves. Lady Margaret had chosen to retire from London society and had taken up residence in a smaller property on the family estate, where she devoted herself to charitable work among the local population. Her letters to Charlotte were filled with descriptions of activities that brought her into contact with ordinary people whose problems could be solved through practical assistance rather than social maneuvering. "I have discovered," she wrote, "that the love I felt for you as my daughter was never dependent upon the circumstances of your birth. If anything, knowing the courage that your natural mother showed in ensuring your welfare has increased my admiration for the strength that runs in your bloodline. You carry the best qualities of both families, and I am proud to have played a role in nurturing them." Dr. Matthews continued to correspond regularly with Charlotte, sharing news of the medical advances he was implementing in his practice, and seeking her advice on matters that required the kind of practical intelligence she had developed during her work with Lady Eloise. His letters revealed a man who had found renewed purpose in his profession, and who valued their continued friendship as one of the most meaningful relationships in his life. As autumn gave way to winter in Bath, Charlotte began to make plans for a future that would have been unimaginable a year earlier. Mr. Whitmore had proposed marriage in terms that honored both her changed circumstances and her inherent worth, offering a partnership based upon equality and mutual support rather than the traditional arrangements that subordinated wives to their husbands' social and financial dominance. Their wedding, planned for the following spring, would be a modest affair compared to the elaborate ceremony that would have marked her marriage to Lord Pemberton. Yet Charlotte found herself anticipating it with a joy that had been absent from her previous engagement, knowing that it would represent the beginning of a life built upon authentic foundations rather than social conventions. The evening before accepting Mr. Whitmore's proposal, Charlotte sat in her small but comfortable room, holding the portrait of Isabella Hartwell and reflecting upon the remarkable journey that had brought her to this moment. The young woman in the painting seemed to smile with approval, as if recognizing that her daughter had finally discovered the courage and wisdom necessary to create a meaningful life from difficult circumstances. "Thank you," Charlotte whispered to the portrait, "for showing me that nobility comes from character rather than breeding, that love is more valuable than status, and that true happiness can only be built upon foundations of honesty and authenticity." Outside her window, the lights of Bath twinkled like stars, each one representing a life that had been shaped by choices rather than circumstances, by courage rather than privilege, by the endless human capacity for growth and transformation. Charlotte closed her eyes and imagined the future that stretched before her, uncertain but filled with possibilities that her aristocratic youth could never have provided. The final words of Lord Ashworth's testament, which Mr. Blackwood had read on that devastating afternoon so many months ago, returned to her memory with new meaning. "I pray that Charlotte will forgive the deception that marked her upbringing, and will discover that the truth, however painful, provides a foundation for authentic happiness that lies can never support." Standing at her window, looking out over the city that had welcomed her despite her changed circumstances, Charlotte understood that her father's final gift had not been the modest financial provision he had made for her welfare, but the liberation that came from living without pretense. The revelation that had seemed to destroy her life had actually provided the opportunity to build a new one based upon truth, rather than comfortable illusions. As she prepared for sleep on this winter evening, Charlotte offered a prayer of gratitude for the journey that had brought her from the marble halls of Thornfield Manor to this modest room in Bath, from the artificial world of aristocratic privilege to the authentic realm of earned contentment. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities, but she faced them with the confidence of one who had discovered that happiness could be created rather than inherited, and that true nobility resided in the human heart rather than in ancient bloodlines. The story of Charlotte Ashworth, bastard daughter of the 7th Earl of Thornfield, had become the story of Charlotte Whitmore, a woman who had learned to value authenticity over appearance, character over breeding, and love over convenience. In losing everything she had thought defined her, she had found everything she truly needed to create a life of genuine meaning and lasting happiness.